Hi and welcome back. I've dried that frisket very lightly with a hair dryer. Like I said, don't scorch it, bake it on there. Use it from a distance, or you can just let it set and dry on its own naturally. It just takes a little longer. I'm going to take this 2-inch Creative Mark hockey brush, and I've got my colors on my palette. I have some of the Lucas Ultramarine Blue, Burnt Sienna, and Raw Sienna. I've got this mister bottle. If your paints start to dry out and skim over a little bit, which they will eventually, especially in this hotter studio lighting. You can give those a little shot of water every now and then with the mister bottle just to loosen those up. I'm going to pre-mix a couple colors, maybe even 3 colors. What I want to do is put in a background sky. Now, if you notice my pencil line here, what I have envisioned is this is going to be a snowy meadow, some white birches. There's a lot of white in this, like I said at the beginning. We're going to have some cloud movements that will be white paper. We've got some white snow, we've got the white of the birches, so we're using a lot of paper white, and this is the accepted way to do watercolors. A lot of watercolors strive to work transparently, use a lot of paper white. This is a great way to get you started with that, just to get the idea of it. I'm going to take this hockey brush and I'm going to mix up my sky color, which I'm going to take. The thing about these hockey brushes, these hold a ton of water. That's the great thing about them. I'm going to take a couple brushfuls of water, and I'm going to work some of this ultramarine blue into that. Now, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna are complementary colors because this is blue, this is orange. The burnt sienna is actually a darker orange. So if I wanted to gray that ever so slightly and give it even a cooler, more overcast, wintry feel, I could sneak just a little touch of that burnt sienna in there, which will gray that. Now, one thing you want to be aware of with watercolors always dry lighter. So you want to make your color a little darker on your palette than you think you ultimately want it, because we are going to wet the background sky area. And when we put this in, it equals the same thing as if we were putting this blue paint into white paint. The water on the paper will dilute it and tint it out, make it lighter, just as if you were adding white paint to it. Now, these brushes are very absorbent, so usually it looks like there's none on my palette. It's all in my brush. I literally take the brush like this and I squeeze it out. There's all my paint right there. So squeeze that out of your brush. That will be my sky color. I'm going to wipe my brush off. And I'm thinking I want background trees in there. The thing is, with watercolor, the beauty of watercolor is that its inherent nature is that you can put it on the paper and let it flow together and do its own thing, which is great. It gives you soft edges in the backgrounds where you want them. It makes it more interesting because the colors literally melt together. With oil or acrylic, you have to take a stiffer brush and work them together. These will just, you drop them next to each other and they just flow and mingle, which is great. I'm going to take this same brush, I wiped it off, and over here I'm going to mix a puddle of burnt sienna and a little blue. This one is more blue, less sienna. This one's more sienna, less blue. And I just want something kind of a darker brownish color. I'm thinking maybe dead winter trees. And same thing, I'm going to squeeze the paint out of that because it holds a ton of my color. It's all right there. Now, the reason I'm pre-mixing the colors is because once I wet this paper, this is 140-pound paper, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that. It's Arch's brand, but it's 140-pound, which means the thickness. It only stays wet a certain amount of time. I can saturate this page, and within 3-4 minutes, it's starting to dry out. So what I'm going to do is wet this and then put the background colors in, and as long as that stays wet, I can work with it. But usually, the rule of thumb, you have 2 or 3 minutes. So you'll see that I'm going to work very quickly. I'm going to get a fresh paper towel in my hand, because you're going to want to wipe your brush off as you go. I'm going to show you a really nice way to do some cloud movements in this sky. While it's wet, I'm going to come down and I'm going to attack the tree line and put this color in the tree line. I might even grab this brush at the last minute and come in with some of the yellow, which is the raw sienna, and the ultramarine blue, and mix the color on the fly and put a few indications of some green in there, just to liven this up. So what it amounts to is I've got a clean brush. Now I've wiped this off and rinsed it out. And I'm going to saturate my background sky. Now be careful you don't lift your frisket as you do that. I'm going to come in and really saturate this. Look how wet I'm getting that. It's very wet. The thing is, you want to make it wetter than what you're going to want. If it's wet like this and I go to put paint in it right now, it's totally uncontrollable. A lot of people will wait, they wet the paper, and then they'll sit here for 5 minutes and let it soak in, and once it loses its sheen, then they go in and add their paint. I'm not all that patient when it comes to that, so what I like to do is this. I will really saturate it, and I hope that's picking up on camera. That is really soaked. Well, what I like to do is wipe this brush off. These are the goat hair brushes, and they are just so absorbent. What I do is dampen this off. It makes it thirsty like a sponge, And with that thirsty brush, I come back and I just brush over. It lifts off all the excess, and you'll see that the shine has gone away, but it's still very, very damp. From there, you've got 2, maybe 3 minutes to get your color on there. I'm just picking off an excess hair there. So I'm going to get right at it. That's why I pre-mixed my colors. I don't have to spend all my time mixing colors now. It's done for me. What I do is take the corner of the brush like this and just be very loose and random with it. What I'm doing is leaving some sky openings in there, which are going to be the white clouds, actually, I should say. I'm painting the blue sky, but I'm leaving some white patches that will represent clouds. So a lot of times people have a tendency to do this. I've got some little sheets here I want to show you. Just because you've got a square brush doesn't mean you have to get these square shapes all the time. If you use the corner of the brush and just kind of dance around, you get a much more interesting and random take on that. So don't think in terms of using the square of the brush. Notice how I'm kind of using the corner. And as I go lower, I want the value to lighten, so I'm actually going to take some of the paint off the brush. But see, you want to leave that nice and open and breathable. You want that sky to look like it's got atmosphere in it. As I come a little lower, I'm using even less paint. My tree line will kind of override over the top of that. Immediately, I'm going to rinse this brush out and blot it off. And by making it thirsty again, notice these harder edges against the white. I can come in like this with just the corner and see how it lifts the blue. And I can soften these edges make them very wispy. I'm actually just lifting some of the blue with the corner of that thirsty brush. You've got to catch it while it's good and wet. But see how that just softens that and makes it look so much more like a cloud. That is the easiest way to do a convincing sky with watercolor. You drop it in there and then soften your edges. Make sure that this brush has been wrung out very well and there's no moisture in it. That's the key. Okay, now while this bottom area is still damp, and I see that's starting to tack up a little bit just because of the studio lighting in here, it's very warm, I'm going to get on these other trees. All I want is just the general indication of a tree line back here, and I want it kind of in the brownish gray tone because it's winter time. And like I said, I'm from northern New York, so I know all about winter. You look out through the woods and you see all these browns and grays. And I'm just going to kind of outline my horizon to get started, and then I can just kind of do this with the point of the brush and the side of the brush. I'm trying to get an interesting flow, believable tree line, just something that looks interesting. Notice how that's diffusing into the sky color and leaving me a soft edge, which is what I want. It'll make it look more distant. It's important to get in there and catch this while that background sky is wet. Shedding some hairs here, so I'll pluck those off after the fact once this is dry. No rush for that right now. See, I'm trying to get an interesting shape and let that diffuse into the background. Now you can do this. I know you can. This is so simple. Just don't paint anything too perfectly and too symmetrically. That's the key. Most people, when they start, try to get everything too perfect. That's the last thing you want to do. Okay, while I've got that going, remember earlier on I said maybe I would incorporate a few fir trees in there. If I take some of the ultramarine blue and a little bit of that raw sienna, it will yield a green tone. I want something kind of on a bluish green tone, like maybe a spruce tree, something along that line. So I'm not looking for a real bright green, something greenish. Maybe something about like that. And again, I want to try to get some of these in here while this is still damp enough to soften it. And I kind of put in a trunk line, and then I just dab with the corner of the brush, or the point of the brush, end of the brush I should say, and I just kind of let that soften down into some of those other trees. So it looks like you got trees growing within trees. Sometimes you can bring some of them right down into the foreground so they come all the way down. I'm going to put another taller one right there. And these are pretty easy. I'm assuming you're going to watch this first and then try it later. I would recommend watching this video all the way through before you try this. So once I get done with these, I've got to put these in now while this is damp. Once this is in and I'm letting this tack up a little bit, I'll show you on another card how to do these trees. I'll give you a little bit more of a detailed description on how to render these trees. They're actually pretty easy. Watercolor is a wonderful medium for this nice soft diffusion. Like I said, the color will do it on its own. You just drop it in while everything's wet. You don't have to push it around like you do with the oils and the water and the acrylics. So however many of these you want to put in, maybe I'll sneak one right in over here so it's going to overlap behind that one birch tree. And notice I'm the paper's a little wetter here, so it yields a softer value, a little lighter. This one, the paper was a little drier, it comes out a little darker. That's all good. You want variety in that. And so you can actually mix more color right on the fly. Like I said, as long as that stays damp enough, and I can tell by the sheen of that paper, I've still got a little bit of time left. It all depends on how quickly this dries out. It depends on the weight of the paper, how much you've saturated it, and what the room temperature is that you're working in. All those things come into play. So maybe I'll put a little shorter one right in here. Now that's still very wet right there, so that's going to diffuse a lot, which is okay. But I'm going to bring this one right down to the horizon line a little bit. So some will look further back in the woods, and they've got maybe some of the dead trees in front of them. Some of these will come right down to the horizon line where they look like they're just setting over the knoll. So you get different depths and distances on that. Maybe I'll put one more over here somewhere. And then I'll show you how to do these. In the meantime, this will be drying up a little bit, and then we can come in with the next step. Okay. That's looking pretty good, don't you think? Yeah, I think so.